Before I start this video, I just want to remind people that I'm doing the Run for Autism Challenge in October, but from now until then we'll be raising money. I'll be putting links in the description of this video and other videos subsequent to this video. So yeah, if you feel like you want to put a donation through, go through that link. Alright, smashing. Let's crack on. How's it going, everybody? It's your Mosasaur Prince Steel Tethyosaurus Yorkshire, and today's video I thought we'd talk about a particular kind of mosasaur that doesn't really get any coverage, apart from when it got covered in the Surviving Earth episode 4, When the Seas Died, I think that's what it's called, and it's Portunatasaurus. Now, Portunatasaurus is a very recently described egg yellowsaur, only within the last 7 years, but nobody seems to talk about it. But the paper describing it and subsequent research on it is absolutely fascinating. So I thought, since it's been featured in Surviving Earth, I thought I'd feature it more in one of my videos. So we're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about what I dubbed the Croatian reef lizard, Portunatasaurus. Let's go. So old Porty here, without a starboard, is a plesiopedal mosasauroid. We're not entirely sure if he's got a plesiopelvic or hydropelvic condition. Basically, he's got a pelvis meant for land, or he's got a pelvis meant for the water. But he belongs to the Aegyallosaur mosasauroids. Now, what are Aegyallosauroids and how do they relate to Portunatasaurus? So, the Aegyallosaurs were a primitive bunch of mosasaurs. In fact, they're the ancestors of the basal mosasaurids, so like your Tethyosaurus, Panoneosaurus, Romeosaurus, and your more advanced, your more derived mosasaurids, so your Mosasaurus, Tylosaurus, Platycarpus, all them fellas. Aegyallosaurs, you would have mistaken them for probably Tethyosaurus-like animals, but they had a bit more primitive features, so their limbs were more suited for bearing weight on the land, so these guys could actually return to the shore if they needed to. They had a less adapted pelvis for aquatic locomotion, so these were what we consider plesiopedal, so primitive hands, plesiopelvic, primitive pelvis. So these fellas, they probably could have swam a bit more like a crocodile than they could, say, like a mosasaurus or an anaconda. So they would have stuck more towards the coastal areas, and these would have lived during the Cenomanian to the Turonian, so around about 100 to maybe 89 million years ago. So they had a nice brief little window. And Portunatasaurus was one of these Aegyallosaurs. Now, exactly where it fits in within the Aegyallosauridae, we're not entirely sure, because unfortunately the specimen that we recovered, which estimates an animal of about 1 metre in length, we've only found the front of it. We've found everything past the pelvis. So we know about the front bit, we don't know about the back bit. But then again, I think the back bit would stink anyways, so I don't think we want to know. But Portunatasaurus, the only specimen that we know of, was actually found in Dugi Otok in Croatia, which is a little island just off the coast of mainland Croatia. This material was found in Cenomanian Turonian boundary platy limestone, so we know this would have been a shallow marine environment that Portunatasaurus would have inhabited, and it would have inhabited this area with a bunch of other creatures like fish, bivalves, and other various animals, probably plesiosaurs in there. Unfortunately, a lot of the research I've tried to do around this area doesn't really reveal any decent fossil material, but then again, I could have missed it. And you're not going to point it out to me, and I tell you what, keep it to this end. Now, in terms of dating, roughly Portunatasaurus probably would have lived between 99.7 to 94.3 million years ago. So it would have been on just after the cusp of the evolution of the Aegyallosaurs, and probably just before the emergence of the basal mosasaurids. So let's break down the name. So Portunatasaurus means Dugi Otok lizard, as in the island that the specimen was actually found on. And the specific name, the species name of Portunatasaurus, Krambergeri, is actually in reference and in honour of Dr. Kramberger, who was a Croatian geologist, paleontologist, paleoanthropologist, university professor and director of the Geological and Paleontological Department of the National Museum in Zagreb. Did a lot, and to be fair, to have a little marine lizard named after there, that's top class. That I'd love that, mate. Now, the Portunatasaurus holotype, and the only specimen we know of Portunatasaurus, was actually discovered back in 2008 in Croatia. Now, Croatia is famous for two other Aegyallosaurs, two close relatives of Portunatasaurus. Aegyallosaurus, the namesake of the family, and Opetiosaurus, which is sometimes sunk into Aegyallosaurs occasionally, but I do think they're a separate genus. And 3 Aegyallosaurs in the same area, well, that's a good sign. That means there's a hidden diversity of these animals that we haven't really discovered before. But anyways, 2008, the fossil was discovered over in Dugi Otok in Croatia, and then they had to, well, sort of left it in the rock for about 3 years. Well, not really. What happened is that paleontologists and geologists and other colleagues actually come across the specimen. They realised they had to get it out, but they had to get it out over another 3 seasons. So it actually wasn't until 2011 that the animal was actually excavated. But unfortunately, during that time, a good chunk of the skull, some neck vertebrae and some ribs were unfortunately lost to the elements of nature, so they were eroded away, which is really unfortunate. But there are natural casts in the fossil of those elements, so we haven't totally lost an idea of what these elements look entirely. They are there just in shadow, if you like. Now, the fossil was then transported in 2012 to Canada, to the University of Alberta, where there was further preparation performed upon it, which actually revealed tracheal rings, which they don't actually really get covered in the paper that describes Portunatasaurus, but I really think there's another research paper in there, just looking at the tracheal rings overall. You can get some real detail about how these animals could have actually dived and the diving potential in Aegyalosaurs just from those little fossils there. Now, the fossil was actually featured in a thesis from the main author of the actual original paper in 2017, but then got its own paper in 2019 where we got the whole description of the animal and the fact that we can say, hey, this fella's actually really key for understanding the transition from weight-bearing limbs to those, you know, flipper limbs, you know, like that. I don't think mosasaurs would have actually slapped about with the flippers. I don't think, well, they could have slapped me about. I wouldn't want them to, but they probably could have. Now, from this paper and the description and the research into this animal, the general anatomy of Portunatasaurus is that it had a very small skull, only about 14 centimeters in length. Its neck vertebrae had some similarities with other Aegyalosaurs, which meant that there was some flexibility there, but not too restrictive like you see in mosasaurids. So this thing could actually arch its neck about, like I can't because I've got a knackered neck. The number of vertebrae between the neck and the tail were actually similar number to Aegyalosaurus, which means this animal is probably more closely related to Aegyalosaurus than other Aegyalosaurs, so that's a nice indicator. Now, what's interesting enough about the shoulder and limb anatomy of Portunatasaurus, and what was actually quite a big highlight in the paper discussing this animal, is that there was a lot of similarities in terms of the anatomy with mosasaurines. Now, these were later living mosasaurs. These were the ones with paddles and flippers. But for features to show up this early on in mosasaur evolution, this shows how increasingly important this particular transition in time, the Cenomanian was to mosasaur evolution, and particularly with Portunatasaurus. In particular, the shoulder shows a lot of mosasaurian adaptations, but overall as that Aegyalosaur generalistic anatomy. But one particular feature is that there's no coarsification. Basically, there's not too much fusion in the shoulder bones, which meant there was more flexibility in the arms. So Portunatasaurus could use its arms a bit more than some other Aegyalosaurs. Now, your upper and your lower arms in Portunatasaurus, those arm bones were actually overall a bit shorter and a bit broader in this animal than other Aegyalosaurs, which had more elongate limbs, even though this fella could take its end back up on land, but it was showing more of those mosasaurian features. Additionally, some of the finger bones were actually broader and flatter than in Aegyalosaurs, so they were more like mosasaurian fingers, which is crazy because this animal, when you look at it in general, this thing looks more like an Aegyalosaur, but it's got those very subtle features that say, hey, this fella is becoming more and more aquatic. What's interesting is that when you put all these features together, Portunatasaurus in the Croatian seas was actually in a similar role to Tethysaurus than it was to Aegyalosaurus. Even though it's more close related to the latter, these subtle adaptations and changes in its forelimbs would have actually meant that ecologically, this animal was moving more towards a more aquatically adapted role than it was its close relative. That's crazy, that. To me at least, that's madness. That this thing is showing Aegyalosaur overall, but its subtle features allowed it to be more mosasaurid than Aegyalosaur. But overall, this thing's on telly, so now it's a superstar. And anyways guys, hope you enjoyed this video, hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you later. Ta-da, bye.